If you could go back in time, what would you change about your life? This was a question that I was posed with in a classroom of seniors. And I know that when that question comes, I've seen it where people will say, I wouldn't change nothing because the experiences that I went through made me into the person I am today. I disagree. I disagree. And I'll share with you why. Because it's not the experiences, in my opinion, it's the teacher in the classroom of experience that molds us, that shapes us, that fashions us into the people that we are today. It's the teacher, quotation mark, the teacher, not the experience. If it's the experience, then I worship the experience. If I worship the experience turns into stagnation, which transitions into a stumbling block. And it looks like this. I graduated from college in 2009 with a bachelor's degree in business administration. Experience. I begin to honor the experience. If the experience is the teacher, I begin to worship the experience and never move forward because I'm holding on to the experience instead of holding on to the teacher in the experience. Experience is the classroom, but without a teacher, you cannot learn. It's very literal. You go into a physical classroom, you can go into that classroom, but if there's nobody teaching, then the ability to learn is not present. Would I change anything in my life if I could go back in time? Absolutely. This is what I will go back and change. Me going into high school, prioritizing romantic relationships. Because when I prioritize the romantic relationship, I end up getting hurt because I put a large amount of my time, effort, emotion, and energy into a relationship and into a person that wasn't whole. I myself wasn't even whole. This is why I don't promote teenagers, specifically in high school, to be into relationships romantically because we're all still growing. We're all still developing. It will be a best practice to ignore these relationships, but it's difficult and almost impossible because there's a social component and we all, men and women, are attracted to one another. And the natural course of action is to learn more about that individual. Then you have the emotions that's connected to that. In my example, I got hurt just because that was the experience that I had. I can attribute it to many things, but the question is, what would I have changed? If I could change anything, I would change that. The reason being is because the hurt, the rejection, the pain, the resentment, the bitterness took root in me and manifested into fruit, behavior that I was unaware of because I accepted that behavior as a norm. And that behavior was a norm in my life for at least a decade or more. That fruit wasn't recognized. The behavior wasn't recognized as abnormal until I was about 28 or 29 years of age. And the identification came from my mentor, a person who was outside of me, outside of my experience, outside of my perspective. But because the relationship was built in such a way that I was at a place of vulnerability and sharing, he was able to identify it, and it set me on a path of freedom. And I'm grateful to him to this day. If that could have been changed, then life would have been vastly different. I'm thankful for the life that I live now, but there's always room for change. There's always room for adjustments. There's always room to make alterations in how we live. The lesson that we can learn from this conversation, it's many lessons, but one is to learn from other people's mistakes. And how do we learn from other people's mistakes? Humility. It's important to tap in to whom and what we have access to, because we all have different stories in our lives of triumph, of victory, and even defeat and loss. But it's important to place honor on those individuals and the stories and the experiences that was had, because if we can really learn from those experiences and receive the impartation from those individuals, we will not have to repeat cycles. That what I shared with you, that decade of struggle, that decade of living in a normal life, that decade of being in relationships where I couldn't fully engage because I had been hurt by someone or had experienced hurt, and it was a reoccurring cycle, would have been no more, because that cycle would have been identified, or my behavior would have been in a different direction, and that cycle no longer manifest. These are key lessons and components that we can gather from other people's experiences. The last piece that I will give you in regards to this conversation and what we can gather from it is this. You've heard this said time and time again: do not judge a book by its cover. When we judge the person by our perception externally, it produces a preconceived notion. P-R-E, conceive, birth, before we understand about the individual, who they are, their backstory, their history, their inspirations, their aspirations, their victories, their triumphs, and their struggles. It's important not to come in with preconceived notions when we're meeting new individuals. Because when we judge a book by its cover, we disqualify the story that's on the pages of the book. We all have chapters in our life: chapter 1, chapter 2, 3, 4, 5, so on, so forth, etc., etc. It's important to understand that what I see may not be what you be, but it takes a spirit of humility to look at a person and learn more about them than what we see on the surface. And if we do, we can connect in a posture of humility and learn and glean and gather and apply and build together a foundation that will stand strong when the winds of life blow.